was too thick, too heavy to think clearly. Another clicking sound echoed, closer this time. "Stay close," Daniel whispered, pulling them together. He could feel his heart thudding painfully in his chest, each beat sounding louder than the last. The clicking noise was almost rhythmic, deliberate, like it was something waiting for them to cross into its territory. And then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet shifted. The floor opened up with an ominous groan, a deep rumble that sent a jolt through the chamber. Daniel staggered, nearly losing his balance, but Emily grabbed him. "Stay steady," she urged, her voice surprisingly calm, though her eyes betrayed the fear she was trying to mask. Daniel stepped back, his breath caught in his throat. The floor had split open, revealing a dark, pulsing cavity beneath. The walls of the opening were lined with the same eerie blue glow, and a black substance that resembled thick tar seemed to flow and move within the cavity like a living thing. "Is that—" Emily trailed off, her voice faltering. "It's moving," Daniel finished, his eyes narrowing as he watched the substance shift and churn. Before they could react, the clicking grew louder, and then a shadow, a long, twisting shape emerged from the darkness, its limbs pulsating as it slithered across the floor. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite like anything they had ever seen. The creature's body was tentacle-like, its movements both fluid and erratic, as if it were not entirely part of this world. It paused for a moment, its hundreds of small eyes flickering in their direction, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, glowing teeth. It was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He gripped Emily's hand tighter, and for a moment, they just stood there, motionless, the sound of their breathing, the only thing breaking the silence. The creature made no move yet. It just watched. And in that moment, Daniel realized with a cold jolt that they were not alone in this place. The creature's eyes, dozens of them, reflected an eerie light in the dimness of the chamber, their unnatural glow sending a chill down Daniel's spine. It was as though each eye was a separate entity, watching, calculating, waiting for them to make a move. The air felt thicker now, suffocating, as if the very presence of this thing had changed the atmosphere around them. Daniel's grip on Emily's hand tightened, and he could feel her trembling next to him. Noah's small form was pressed tightly against her side, his wide eyes darting between his parents and the monstrous being that loomed before them. The clicking noises had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving, as if the creature itself was holding its breath. "Do we move?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. They were vulnerable, trapped in the open with the creature watching them. But where would they go? The chasm behind them was impassable, and this thing in front of them was blocking their path. He looked to the left and right, hoping to spot some kind of exit, some sign of escape, but the walls of the chamber were slick and featureless, the ground beneath them pulsating with an unnatural energy. There was nowhere to run. "We need to get get past it, Daniel muttered under his breath. But we can't fight it. Is it alive? Noah whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. He had no idea what this thing was, but it was undeniably alive, its body shifting and twitching with an unsettling rhythm. It wasn't just a monster. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for a very long time. Suddenly, the creature moved. Slowly at first, it began to undulate, its long, sinuous body stretching out toward them. The motion was smooth, almost hypnotic, like the creature was testing the air, gauging their response. It didn't seem to have any immediate intention of attacking, but the tension in the chamber was suffocating. The silence was shattered by the faintest sound, a low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the air. Daniel felt it in his chest, a deep resonance that seemed to be coming from the creature itself. It was as if it were communicating with something or someone beyond their understanding. "We have to get out of here," Emily whispered urgently, her face pale. "This isn't just any creature. It's part of this place. We're not supposed to be here." Daniel nodded, his mind spinning. There had to be something, some way to get past this thing, to move forward, to survive. The creature's head tilted slightly as if acknowledging their presence. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into Daniel's bones. Then, without warning, the creature surged forward, its massive form rippling through the air. It was too fast. "Move!" Daniel shouted. He grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her back, but the creature's tentacle like limbs lashed out with blinding speed, slamming into the ground in front of them, cutting off their escape. The ground beneath them trembled as the creature slithered closer. Daniel could feel the heat radiating from it, its presence overwhelming every sense. Its eyes never left them, its massive body coiling and uncoiling with a sickening fluidity. "We need to fight it," Daniel said, his voice shaking. But the words had already left his mouth. It was a desperate thought. He didn't know how they could fight something so unnatural, so far beyond their understanding. But they didn't have a choice. Emily pulled Noah closer to her, her eyes wide with terror. "Daniel, there's no way. We need to find another way out, now." But Daniel didn't hear her. He was already reaching for his knife, his thoughts racing. He knew it was futile, that the odds were stacked against them. But what else could be? He'd do. What choice did they have? The creature's tendrils reached out, swaying through the air like serpents searching for prey. Its mass filled the space around them, and the air grew thick with an almost palpable sense of malice. Daniel raised the knife, his heart pounding, but his arms felt weak. The creature was too fast, too powerful. It didn't even need to attack. Its mere presence was enough to crush them. "Daniel," Emily whispered, her voice breaking through his panic. "We need to think. There has to be a way." Before she could finish, the creature lunged. In a blur of movement, it struck with incredible force, its tentacles whipping through the air like living whips. Daniel barely managed to dodge one that struck the ground beside him, the force of it shaking the very earth. The impact was deafening, sending shockwaves through the chamber. He stumbled backward, barely maintaining his balance. Emily screamed, pulling Noah away from the advancing creature. The ground beneath them cracked, and Daniel saw the edges of the floor beginning to give way, crumbling into a dark void below. They were running out of time. "Move!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the far side of the chamber. They couldn't stand still. They couldn't let the creature corner them. They had to keep moving. But as they turned to flee, the walls of the cavern began to shift. The ground beneath their feet started to sink, and the stone shifted like it was alive, blocking off their escape routes. The chamber itself seemed to be closing in, as though the entire structure was a trap, and they were its prey. The creature wasn't just watching them, it was controlling the very environment. "Daniel, please," Emily gasped, her voice filled with panic as they scrambled to find a way out. "What do we do?" Daniel's heart raced. There had to be something. They had to escape, or they'd be swallowed by the darkness, consumed by whatever this place was. But the creature was everywhere, its tendrils writhing in the air, its eyes following their every move. In a final act of desperation, Daniel turned to face the creature. "Leave us alone." But the creature didn't respond. It simply watched, its eyes reflecting the cold, unfeeling emptiness of the abyss. And then, with a terrible sound, the floor beneath them gave way entirely. The floor crumbled beneath Daniel's feet with a deafening crack. Emily's scream echoed in his ears as the ground split wide open, and the three of them were suddenly falling, tumbling into the darkness below. There was no time to react, no time to grasp onto anything. The air whipped past them, cold and unrelenting. The sound of their descent was drowned out by the eerie hum that had filled the chamber moments before. It was as if they were falling into something deeper than just the physical space, a place beyond the reaches of light and reason, a place that was alive in its own terrifying way. Daniel reached out instinctively, his hands grabbing for Emily and Noah, pulling them closer as they fell. The darkness around them seemed to stretch on forever, an endless void that swallowed everything. He could hear his heart pounding in his chest, louder than any noise, louder than the wind, louder than anything else in that infinite drop. Then, with a sudden jolt, they hit something. It wasn't the ground. Not exactly. There was no satisfying thud, no solid surface to land on. Instead, they were caught by an odd, gelatinous mass, soft yet firm, that seemed to absorb the impact and gently cradle their bodies. For a moment, Daniel couldn't tell if he was still falling, or if they had been suspended in midair, the darkness stretching endlessly above and below them. He gasped for breath, his head spinning, and the familiar weight of Emily and Noah in his arms grounded him. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. but the surroundings were still an overwhelming blur, too dark and too alien to process. "Is everyone okay?" Daniel's voice was hoarse as he checked on his family, his hands trembling. Emily groaned beside him, her voice soft but steady. I think so. I'm okay." Noah whimpered faintly, but when Daniel pulled him closer, he realized his son was gripping him tightly. The child was trembling, his face pale and wide-eyed. But he wasn't injured, just frightened, terrified of whatever this place was. "We need to move," Daniel said urgently. He had no idea how far they had fallen, but they couldn't just lie there. Whatever this place was, it wasn't safe. Emily slowly sat up, brushing herself off and glancing around. "Where are we?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, and Daniel could hear the edge of panic creeping in. The surroundings were still too dark to make out clearly, but one thing was certain. The environment was even more alien than before. They had fallen into something that wasn't just another cavern. This place felt like it was alive, like the very air they breathed was pressing against them, suffocating them slowly. The mass they had landed on shifted beneath them, almost like it was responding to their weight. But it didn't feel solid. It felt like they were trapped inside a living organism. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady from the fall. But he forced himself to stay calm. The hum they had heard earlier was still there, but now it was more intense, reverberating through the floor beneath him, through the walls around them. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a vibration that resonated in his chest, as though the very ground was alive, pulsing with an alien energy. "Noah, hold on to me," Daniel said softly, reaching out to his son. The boy nodded, his small fingers gripping his father's hand. Emily, too, grabbed hold of Daniel's other arm, her face still pale. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," Daniels admitted, his heart pounding, "but I have a feeling we're not alone here." The darkness around them seemed to close in as they stood up, the hum growing louder and more intense. The walls, or whatever they were, seemed to shift and breathe with them, the pulsing rhythm matching the thrum of their own hearts. The sense of being watched returned in full force. Only now, it wasn't just the creature from before. It felt like the entire place was watching them. Suddenly the mass beneath them shifted again. Something large, something moving stirred in the darkness nearby, sending a ripple through the air. The sound of slithering, of soft, wet movement echoed through the cavernous space. Daniel instinctively pulled Emily and Noah closer, his pulse racing. Then, from the darkness ahead, a soft, disembodied voice echoed, low and guttural. "Who trespasses here?" The words were incomprehensible, the language strange, but the malice behind them was unmistakable. Daniel's heart raced as the ground beneath them began to vibrate, the resonance intensifying, and the slithering sound grew louder. "Stay close," he whispered, barely able to breathe. This wasn't just a monster they were dealing with. It was something much bigger, something more ancient and far more dangerous. The voice echoed again, louder this time. You are not welcome. Before they could react, a shape moved toward them in the darkness. A massive, shifting shadow, its form impossible to comprehend. It was like something that had been waiting for centuries. Something that lived between worlds. Its shape rippled and shifted with an unnatural fluidity, as if it were both part of the air and the earth. A creature that belonged to a time before time. A being that existed in the spaces between thoughts and reality. Daniel stood frozen, his body tense as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The creature's form was unclear, but one thing was certain. It was moving toward them with a predatory intent, and it was no longer a matter of escape. It was a matter of survival. Without thinking, Daniel pulled Emily and Noah behind him, the knife in his hand now feeling too small, too insignificant against the vastness of the danger they were facing. "Please don't," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to survive this." But Daniel didn't respond. He could feel the creature's presence, feel the oppressive weight of its watchful eyes on them, even though they couldn't see it. It was a feeling that crept under his skin and made every hair on his body stand on end. This wasn't just any monster. This was something ancient, something that had seen the rise and fall of empires, something that had outlived everything and everyone. And now, it was hungry. The creature's form remained shrouded in darkness, but its presence loomed large, suffocating the very air around them. The pulsating hum of the chamber grew in intensity, vibrating through the ground, and the eerie sensation of being watched became almost unbearable. Daniel could feel his breath quicken, the cold sweat trickling down his back as he pressed Emily and Noah further behind him. "Don't move," Daniel whispered hoarsely, though the words felt almost useless in the face of the unknown. He could hear the movement of the creature, slithering through the shadows with an unnatural fluidity. But it was more than that. The space itself seemed to warp and bend, as if the entire environment was alive, breathing in sync with the creature's movements. It was no longer just a battle for survival against something physical. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being distorted. "You trespass in my domain," the voice echoed again, deeper this time, vibrating through their bones. It was a voice with no body, a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. The words were unmistakably clear now, the malice in them seeping through the air. And yet, there was something else, a strange hunger in its tone, an ancient need. Emily trembled next to him, her grip on his arm tight. "What is it? What does it want?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but the desperation in her eyes was enough for Daniel to feel the weight of it. The unknown was terrifying, but it wasn't just that. It was the certainty that they were no longer in control, no longer the ones pulling the strings. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his voice tight. His eyes scanned the shadows, trying to make sense of the movement, the shape, the oppressive presence that had them trapped. But there was nothing, no form to grab onto, no target to strike. It was all around them, this force, this presence that moved like water, like smoke. The voice came again, resonating in the darkness like a distant drumbeat. You will learn the price of trespassing. The ground beneath them began to shift, the mass beneath their feet rippling with an unsettling slowness. Daniel braced himself, feeling the tremor reverberate through his legs. But the sensation was alien. The surface wasn't hard anymore. It had turned soft and viscous, like quicksand. It seemed to pull at their feet, drawing them into the depths, trying to swallow them whole. Run! The voice was softer now, like a soft whisper. But the threat was unmistakable. Get ready. Daniel didn't wait for a response. He didn't even know what to do, but his instinct screamed at him to move. They couldn't wait around for whatever this thing was to make its next move. This was a fight for survival, a fight to keep his family safe. He grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her away from the mass beneath them, but the very air seemed to resist their movements. It was as if something was pressing down on them, something that didn't want them to escape. Something that wanted them trapped immobile. We cannot leave. The voice again. This time it felt different, more insistent. There was a deep thrum beneath the words, like a warning. Suddenly the ground beneath them shifted violently, and Daniel's feet slid out from under him. He landed hard on his back. The breath knocked out of him, and before he could react, a tendril of darkness shot toward him from the depths, wrapping around his ankle with terrifying force. No, Emily screamed. Daniel tried to fight back, kicking his legs, but the force was too strong. It was like trying to break free from a vice, the darkness constricting tighter with every movement. "Dad!" Noah cried out, his voice panicked. I'm okay. Daniel grunted, his voice strained as he tried to pull free, but the tendril held fast. He could feel it tightening, pulling him deeper into the mass, into the dark, unspeakable place beneath him. The voice spoke again, almost soothing now, like a lullaby. "It's too late for you." Suddenly, a burst of light, a flash of raw energy, blazed through the dark, cutting through the gloom like a knife. The tendril recoiled in a violent jerk, and Daniel was thrown to the side, his body slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. His vision blurred for a moment, his head spinning. "Emily," Daniel gasped, trying to rise to his feet, but his legs felt weak. His body felt like it was draining of strength, like whatever force had been pulling at him was still lingering, siphoning away his energy. Emily was already there, pulling him up, her face a mixture of relief and fear. What was that? What happened? She was breathing hard, her voice barely audible over the strange hum that continued to vibrate through the air. Daniel didn't have time to answer. He glanced at Noah, who was still gripping his mother's side, his small form trembling in fear. But before he could say anything, the mass around them shifted again, and the creature emerged from the shadows. It wasn't a creature in the traditional sense. It had no true shape, no true form. It was as if the darkness itself had been twisted into a living being. It pulsed with a sickly glow, its presence overwhelming everything around it. It was both nothing and everything at once, an impossible thing that defied comprehension. And yet, despite its formlessness, Daniel could feel its eyes, countless eyes, all of them focused on him, on his family. The creature seemed to sense their fear, feeding off it, growing stronger with every passing second. You belong to me now. Their voice was no longer distant. It was right there, surrounding them, reverberating through their minds, their hearts. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a force. And then the darkness began to close in. The darkness pressed in on all sides, suffocating, relentless. Daniel's heartbeat thudded in his ears, louder than anything, as the creature's presence loomed over them. The hum that had once been a background noise was now a tangible force, vibrating through their bones, pulling them closer to the abyss. Every movement felt like an effort, as if the very air itself had turned to molasses, heavy and unyielding. Emily's hand trembled as she gripped his arm, and Noah clung to her, his eyes wide with fear. The creature's eyes, or what could only be described as eyes, shifted within the darkness, thousands of them blinking and watching, unblinking in their intensity. It wasn't a single thing they were facing anymore. It was as though the very darkness itself had been given shape, had become alive. You cannot escape. The voice was everywhere, surrounding them. It was a whisper in the wind, a growl in the earth, an echo in their minds. This place is mine. All that enter are consumed. Daniel's body went cold. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was something else entirely. There was no fight here, no escape, only the slow, inevitable pull of the creature's presence. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, pulsating with every word it spoke, and the tendril that had nearly dragged him away was only a small part of what it could do. Please, Emily's voice cracked as she pressed closer to him. What is it? What do we do? The question hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. What did they do? How did you fight something that didn't have a shape? Something that existed beyond all logic? How could you escape something that was both everywhere and nowhere? It felt like they were being swallowed by the very air around them. He didn't have an answer, but he couldn't let the fear take over. Not now, not with Emily and Noah depending on him. We have to keep moving, Daniel said, his voice low but firm, even though his legs felt like they might buckle under him. He scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of hope, any crack in the darkness they could exploit. But there was nothing. The walls were a smooth, shifting surface of inky blackness, and the ground beneath them felt as though it could swallow them whole at any moment. As they began to move, the creature's presence followed. It wasn't physical, but it was pressing in, suffocating them, dragging them deeper into its domain. And the voice continued, an unrelenting stream of whispers, each word curling around their minds like a shackle. You will never leave, the voice sang, not with malice, but with a strange, eerie calm. It was as though the creature was offering them a bargain they had no choice but to accept. "There is no escape. You are mine." Daniel stumbled but managed to catch himself, his eyes still scanning for any sign of a way out. But the longer they moved, the more they realized the truth of what the creature was saying. There were no exits, no paths, only the ever-deepening darkness and the relentless pull of the entity surrounding them. Emily's breath hitched behind him. "Daniel, look." He turned to find her pointing ahead, her face pale as she gazed into the shadows, and in the darkness ahead, something stirred, an outline, faint and shifting, like the silhouette of a massive form taking shape. It wasn't clear at first, but the more Daniel focused, the more it solidified into something horrifyingly familiar. Massive, writhing mass of shadow, its shape indistinct, but growing clearer as it emerged from the depths. It was as though the creature was manifesting itself, taking form, its very presence spreading throughout the entire chamber. It was not just a force anymore. It was something that could be seen, something tangible. "No," Daniel cried out, his voice hoarse. But the words did nothing. He grabbed Emily and Noah, pulling them away from the growing mass. But no matter which direction they moved, it seemed to follow them. A shadow, a presence that was always just a step behind. "You cannot outrun me," the voice whispered again, softer this time, but more assured, more certain. "You will know your place, as all who enter have before you." Daniel's mind raced, his heart pounded, but there were no answers. The air felt thicker now, the shadows pressing against them, suffocating them from all sides. There was no escape. And then, just as he felt they were at their breaking point, a new sound pierced through the gloom. It wasn't the hum of the creature's presence or the whispers of its voice. It was a crackling sound, sharp and distinct, like fire, like electricity. "Daniel." Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to snap him back to reality. "Do you hear that?" Before he could respond, a blinding flash of light erupted from the center of the chamber, momentarily illuminating the entire space. The shadows writhed and screamed, recoiling from the sudden brilliant light, as though it had burned them. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath them shook violently, sending them tumbling. "Get down," Daniel shouted, pushing Emily and Noah to the ground as the light intensified. The creature's voice screeched in agony, an ear-piercing sound that tore through their skulls like 1,000 needles. It was a sound of pain, of something ancient being forced out of existence. The darkness around them flickered and shattered, revealing a fractured reality, as though the space itself was beginning to collapse under the force of the light. But as quickly as the light had appeared, it vanished, leaving the chamber once again bathed in darkness, and the creature's voice, now muffled and distant, echoed through the air, filled with a sense of fading rage. "You think you've won?" it growled, its tone now strained. "You cannot escape. I will find you. I will claim what is mine." For a moment, the silence that followed felt like the calm before the storm. Daniel stood, his mind reeling. The entity was still here, still watching, still hunting. But something had changed. The light had heard it. It wasn't invincible, but it wouldn't give up easily. "Let's go," Daniel said, his voice tight. "We have a chance. We need to move." Emily and Noah nodded, but Daniel could see the fear in their eyes. They had faced horrors before, but this was something beyond their understanding. Something older than time itself. They couldn't outrun it forever, but maybe, just maybe, they could outsmart it. The air felt cooler now, the oppressive heat of the darkness lifting slightly as the creature recoiled. The chamber, though still dim and threatening, no longer seemed to pulse with the same unrelenting energy. There was an eerie stillness to it, as though the world had been suspended in time, holding its breath. But Daniel knew better than to think the danger had passed. The creature, whatever it was still out there. Its presence had only been momentarily weakened by the burst of light, but it would not be gone for long. It was as if it had retreated, licking its wounds, preparing for the next move. The question was, how much time did they have before it returned? How long could they last in this place? Daniel stood with Emily and Noah, their backs pressed against the cold, shifting walls. They were on the move now, though every step felt like a battle against gravity, against the invisible force trying to pull them down. But even in the heavy silence that surrounded them, Daniel knew that they had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not when they were this close to the heart of whatever lay beneath this nightmarish world. "We need to find a way out," Daniel said, his voice low and filled with urgency. He looked around, but the dark landscape around them seemed endless, a vast expanse of shifting shadows and eerie shapes. There was no clear path, no sign of escape, only vast nothingness and the growing sense of entrapment. But Emily's voice broke through the tension, her words quiet but insistent. "Look." Daniel turned to follow her gaze. In the distance, barely visible through the thickening darkness, there was a faint light, a flicker like the pulse of a distant star. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark a glimmer of hope in his chest. "What is that?" Noah asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Daniel replied, but the instinct in him flared. "But it's the only thing we've got. Stay close. We don't know what's waiting for us." They moved toward the light cautiously, every step feeling like a gamble. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft sounds of their breathing and the distant hum that seemed to be rising once again, vibrating through the air, threatening to envelop them. It was almost as though the very space around them was closing in, as if the creature was drawing them back toward it. But they couldn't stop. They had come too far to turn back now. As they approached the source of the light, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight of the shadows seemed to ease, if only slightly. It was like they were walking toward some unseen boundary, the threshold between two worlds, the known and the unknown. Daniel's heart pounded harder as they neared the source, a growing sense of anticipation and dread filling the air. The light was no longer a flicker. It had taken on form, a thin crack in the very fabric of the space itself. It was glowing, faintly, an almost ethereal light. And through it, Daniel could make out shapes, vague outlines, like figures just on the edge of sight. "We're not alone," Emily whispered, fear creeping into her voice. But there was something else, too, something uncertain in her words. She was scared, but also drawn in, like she was reaching for something beyond their comprehension. Daniel stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the crack, unsure of what lay beyond. The creature's presence was still there, like a weight pressing down on their shoulders. But the crack in the air seemed to pulse with something different, something familiar. He could feel the pull of it, the urge to move closer. Then, without warning, a voice broke the silence. "You think you found a way out?" The voice was not the creature's, but it was deep and guttural, laced with something ancient and menacing. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like they were being spoken in his mind rather than out loud. Daniel froze, his hand instinctively reaching for Emily. Noah tensed beside him, but he kept his eyes fixed on the crack in the air. The voice had come from beyond it, and he knew somehow that it wasn't the creature. No, this voice was something different, something older, and it wanted them to stop. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice echoing in the stillness. The air seemed to vibrate with the question, and then the voice responded, its tone colder now, as if mocking him. "You are trespassers. You should never have entered this place. You do not understand what you have awakened." The crack in the air shifted, the light flickering erratically. It seemed to pulse, as though responding to the voice, as though it were a living thing itself. "No," Daniel said firmly. "We came for our family. We won't leave without them." The voice chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the chamber. "You do not have the choice you think you do." With a sudden, violent force, the light from the crack exploded outward, sending a shockwave through the chamber. Daniel's body was thrown back, crashing into the ground as the intense light blazed around them. Emily screamed as Noah's tiny form was flung from her grasp, hurtling toward the edge of the chamber. "No!" Daniel roared, trying to rise, but his body felt heavy, the force of the light pressing down on him, locking him in place. "Noah!" Emily cried, her voice cracking as she reached for him. But the light was unstoppable. It surged with a life of its own, a living force that twisted and churned as though it were trying to consume them whole. Daniel's mind raced, his body feeling as though it were being crushed under the weight of it. Something was wrong. They weren't just fighting the creature anymore. They were fighting a force far older, far more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. And yet, as the light surged, he realized something. They had only one choice: fight. The light continued to burn, a fierce, relentless glow that seared through the very air. Daniel could feel the heat on his skin, the pressure pushing against his chest, making it impossible to breathe. The world around him seemed to narrow. The only thing that existed now was the light and the screaming hum in his ears. Every fiber of his being screamed to escape, to find refuge in the shadows. But there was no escape. Emily was still beside him, her fingers curled into the earth, desperately trying to hold on to Noah as the light threw them backward. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a quiet strength in the way she clung to him, as if she knew they had to keep fighting. "Noah," she cried out again, her voice raw. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to rise, his body unresponsive, too heavy to move against the suffocating weight of the light. Every part of him felt as though it was being pulled, as though the very air was trying to tear him apart, to drag him into the crack that had opened before them. "Stop." The voice, now deeper, more resonant, spoke again. It was a warning, but Daniel refused to listen. They didn't have the luxury of stopping now. Noah was out there, trapped in the storm of light, and he couldn't lose him. He reached out, forcing his limbs to move, to defy the crushing force of the energy around him. His fingers brushed the ground, and for a split second, the earth beneath him seemed to shudder, a tremor that passed through his entire body. The cracks were spreading, not just in the air, but through the ground, through everything. "This is not your battle, mortal." The voice echoed through his mind, its tone shifting again, twisting with something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. "You should not have come. You will be consumed, just like all the others." "No." Daniel's voice rang out, breaking through the chaos in his mind. He couldn't allow the fear to paralyze him. He had seen real danger before. But this was something more primal, something ancient that had waited too long to be disturbed. With a final, desperate lunge, Daniel managed to pull himself to his feet. His legs felt weak, like they might give way at any moment. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. The light had intensified, swirling like a vortex of energy, pulling Noah further into its core. "Emily," Daniel shouted, turning to her. "I need you to help me." She looked at him, eyes wide, but there was something else in her gaze. Determination. She understood. Without a word, she scrambled to her feet, pulling Noah's body toward her, fighting against the pull of the light. She had never been one to back down, and it was that strength that kept them both tethered to reality. But the light surged again, more powerful this time, like a crashing wave knocking them both back. The crack in the air seemed to expand, the light devouring everything around them, spreading outward, taking on a physical form, a tangible force that was too large to comprehend. "No," Daniel shouted again, but his voice was lost in the roar of the explosion that tore through the air, distorting reality itself. In that moment, something shifted. The ground beneath them cracked wide open, and Daniel could feel the pull of the earth, as though the very fabric of the world was being ripped apart. It wasn't just the light anymore. The air itself felt like it was bending, twisting, reshaping. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light faltered. It flickered, sputtered, as if it were struggling against something. The voice, now more fractured, growled in frustration, its presence shaking the space around them. "You are foolish," the voice hissed. "You cannot escape me." But Daniel wasn't listening anymore. The ground beneath him gave way with a sudden, violent jerk, and the space around them seemed to fold in on itself. For a moment, the world blurred, a flash of light and shadow, and then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. They were no longer standing in the chamber of dark shadows. They were falling through the air, through a void that stretched out for miles in every direction, the world around them a blur of darkness and light. Nothing but the sound of wind rushing past them. The ground beneath them had vanished entirely, leaving only the falling, endless void. Daniel reached out, grasping for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. They were falling, plummeting into the unknown, into the heart of whatever lay beyond the fabric of this reality. "Noah," Emily screamed, her voice swallowed by the howling wind. She reached for her son, but he was gone, lost in the chaos, carried away by the unseen forces pulling them down. "You have entered my domain." The voice echoed again, distant but impossibly close at the same time. "And now, you will never leave." Daniel's chest tightened as the air grew colder, the darkness thickening around them. He could feel the pressure of the void pressing against him from every direction. The force of the fall was disorienting, his stomach lurching, but through the panic, through the overwhelming sense of dread, one thought remained clear. They had to find Noah. They had to fight. There was no other choice. The darkness spun faster, and Daniel's mind began to clear. This was no longer just a battle for survival. This was a fight for everything, for his family, for his very soul. And the more he thought about it, the clearer the path became. They weren't just escaping the creature's domain. They were destroying it. The fall seemed endless. The wind whipped around them, a violent howl that echoed through the void, drowning out all sound except for the deafening rush of air and the pounding of Daniel's heart in his chest. There was no up, no down, just an abyss stretching out endlessly, a chasm that threatened to swallow them whole. Daniel fought the panic rising in his throat, the cold sweat that poured down his face, but he couldn't stop the sense of helplessness. They were falling, and they had no control. They were at the mercy of whatever force had sent them tumbling into this strange, distorted realm. Emily's voice cut through the chaos. "We can't just fall forever." She was struggling to keep herself together, to hold on to their son, but the darkness was relentless. The wind tore at them, and her words barely reached his ears. "We need a plan, Daniel, now." His mind raced, trying to grasp onto any shred of rational thought. The fall had to stop eventually, right? They couldn't just keep falling forever. But the more he tried to focus, the more the impossible became clearer. There was something unnatural about this place, something wrong. The laws of nature, gravity, time, space were no longer holding any sway here. The darkness around them thickened, a suffocating presence, as if it were pressing in on them from all sides. Daniel felt his limbs growing heavy, like they were being stretched thin, stretched to their breaking point. He glanced over at Emily, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was reaching for Noah, her hands grasping at the empty space where he had been moments before. "Noah," Emily cried again, her voice strained. "Where is he?" Daniel didn't know. He didn't know where Noah was, or if he was still with them, or if he had somehow been swallowed up by the dark forces that ruled this realm. The pain in Emily's voice cut through him, and he felt it in his chest, a visceral ache that spread through him like wildfire. "I don't know," he said, his own voice hoarse. "But we have to keep going. We can't stop." And so they fell. Minutes, hours. Time had no meaning in this place. The wind grew colder, the darkness deeper. And then, just as the weight of despair threatened to drown them, something changed. It was subtle at first. A soft glow began to form in the distance, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a light in the conventional sense. It wasn't warm or comforting, but rather it shimmered like a flickering flame, something alive within the void. Daniel felt it before he saw it, a sudden pulse of energy, surging up through the dark, rippling outward like a shock wave. The pull of gravity seemed to shift, lessening for a moment, and he felt himself slowing just for an instant. The air thickened as if reality was converging on some unseen point. "Hold on," Daniel shouted, his instincts kicking in. He grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her closer, knowing they were nearing something, some kind of threshold, something dangerous. But whatever it was their only chance. The light, if it could even be called that, grew stronger. It was not the pure golden glow of safety, but rather an unsettling, unnatural light that twisted through the air. It was like a rift, a crack in reality itself. The walls of their fall seemed to fracture, breaking apart, revealing glimpses of other places, other worlds or dimensions, far beyond the one they had known. And then, with a violent jerk, they were no longer falling. The world shuddered around them, warping and distorting. Daniel gasped for air, the ground beneath them shifting. They weren't in free fall anymore. They had landed somewhere. It was a place unlike any they had ever seen. The air was still, unnervingly so. It was as though the very space around them had been frozen in time. The ground beneath their feet was solid but strange, smooth like glass, yet slick to the touch. The sky above them was a swirling mass of shifting shadows and the light, neither day nor night, but something in between. "Where are we?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she stood slowly, her eyes darting around in fear. Daniel didn't know how to answer. The unreality of their surroundings was suffocating. He couldn't understand it. It was as though they had stepped into a world outside of time, a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. And yet, in the distance, through the haze of shifting shadows, he thought he saw something. A figure, a shape, a flicker of movement. His pulse quickened. Is that? Before he could finish his sentence, the figure appeared more clearly. It was Noah, but not the Noah they had known. The boy stood motionless, his form glowing with a soft, eerie light. He was frozen in place, staring blankly ahead, his eyes wide and vacant, his body standing at the edge of some vast chasm, as if he were a part of this strange world itself. "Noah!" Emily screamed, breaking into a run. "Noah, it's really you!" Daniel tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, as though the very air itself was holding him back. Every step was a struggle, each movement a battle against the strange forces pressing down on him. He could barely breathe, the atmosphere thick with tension, with something unseen, but undeniably present. "Noah!" Emily cried again, her voice full of desperation. As she reached the boy, she stopped, her hand outstretched. But she didn't touch him. She was too afraid, too aware that something was not right. This wasn't her son. Not anymore. This was something else. "Noah," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "Can you hear me?" The boy's eyes flickered for a moment, just a brief flicker. His gaze shifted toward Daniel, a glimmer of recognition. Then, just as quickly, the light around Noah intensified, and he stepped back. "Noah!" Emily cried out, but it was too late. The figure, her son, vanished, swallowed by the shadows in the distance, as though he had never been there. The air grew still again, suffocating, and the dark energy around them seemed to pulse with new intensity. "It's too late for him." The voice came from behind them, deep and resonant. It echoed like a thunderclap, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Daniel spun, his heart racing. He had heard that voice before. The creature, the ancient force that had been chasing them. And now, it was here, watching them, waiting. It had always been waiting. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, pulsating with a malignant presence that pressed in on them from every direction. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, a force beyond comprehension. It was as though the fabric of reality had been torn open, and they had fallen into the gaping wound. The land around them was alien, distorted, but something far more sinister loomed at its core. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the voice, the one that had haunted them throughout their journey, the one that had whispered its terrifying promises of despair. The figure materialized before them, a presence both massive and formless, its edges blurred like smoke that moved against the wind, distorting the air itself. Its voice echoed again, like a deep rumble from the earth, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. "You should have known." The creature's voice was both ancient and infinite, resonating with a weight that felt as though it could crush their very souls. "This place is mine." Emily trembled beside Daniel, but her fear was tempered with something else, a flicker of defiance. She reached for his hand, her grip firm as if pulling strength from him. From them. "We're not afraid of you," she spat, her voice shaky but unwavering. The creature's form shuddered, as if amused, or perhaps irritated. Its presence rippled outward, distorting the reality around them. "You should be." Daniel felt the pulse of dark energy reverberate through the ground, a force so palpable it felt like a living thing, coiling and thrashing beneath their feet. The sky above them churned, swirling with violent, unnatural winds, as though the very atmosphere itself was buckling under the weight of its power. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape, to save Emily and Noah, to escape the horror that was closing in around them, but he couldn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, bound by the unyielding gravity of fear, as though the creature's presence had anchored him in place, draining his will to resist. The creature drifted closer, its form expanding and contracting, a dark mass that flickered with unseen eyes. It was impossible to tell if it had a body, or if it was merely a manifestation of sheer power. Its voice, deep and guttural, echoed inside his skull. "You cannot fight me, Daniel. You cannot escape me." Daniel swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "What do you want?" The words felt weak, but they were the only ones he could muster. "I want nothing." The creature's voice softened, becoming almost gentle, as though speaking to a child. "I have waited for eons. You and your kind are mere whispers in the winds of time." Emily stepped forward, her voice more commanding now. "We're not just going to give up. We'll fight you until the end. We won't let you win." Her eyes were steady, though they burned with fear. She knew the odds were against them, but she refused to accept defeat. The creature's form shuddered, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. "You cannot even comprehend the power I possess. I am beyond your feeble minds." Its voice seemed to stretch, warping through the very air around them, distorting reality. But something shifted in the air. Daniel felt it. There was a pulse, a subtle, low hum that seemed to resonate from deep within the ground, as though something was beginning to respond to the creature's arrogance. Something hidden, waiting in the darkness. For a brief moment, the creature faltered, its form wavering, as if it had sensed something that even it could not control. "No!" The creature roared, its voice crackling with rage. It lashed out, its form expanding, tendrils of darkness reaching for Daniel and Emily, coiling through the air like serpents of pure shadow. But before the tendrils could strike, the hum grew louder, and a crack split the air. The world seemed to quake beneath them, the ground rumbling as though it were about to break apart. And then, a blinding light erupted from the center of the rift, flooding the darkness with its brilliance, pushing back against the oppressive shadow that had surrounded them. "What is this?" The creature's voice grew frantic, its form shrinking back from the light, as though it were being burned by its intensity. "You cannot But it was too late. The light surged forward, washing over everything, filling every corner of the void, banishing the shadow that had claimed this place. Daniel could feel the pressure in his chest ease, the grip of fear loosening as the light reached out, wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. No, the creature screamed, but its form began to crumble, unraveling like dust in the wind. The light was consuming it, erasing it from existence, pulling it into some other realm beyond their reach. And then, in a final burst of energy, the light exploded outward, the force of it so overwhelming that Daniel felt his body lifted off the ground. His mind reeled as the world around them twisted and shifted, the air growing impossibly thin. But just as suddenly, the light dimmed, and everything stilled. Daniel gasped, his body falling to the ground with a heavy thud. His chest ached, and he could barely breathe. But the oppressive presence was gone. The creature, whatever it was, had been defeated or at least banished. He looked around. The world they had fallen into was still there, but it had changed. The sky was no longer a swirling mass of shadows and light. It was clear now, a soft blue, untouched by the dark forces that had ruled it. The ground beneath them was solid, normal, as though they had been transported back to some kind of safe haven. But then his eyes landed on Emily. She was standing, panting, eyes wide, a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief on her face. And beside her, Noah. He was there. For a moment, everything froze. The world seemed to hold its breath. Noah was alive, standing before them, his eyes wide with confusion, but with no sign of the darkness that had consumed him before. Noah, Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she reached out to him, as if afraid he might vanish again. Noah blinked, his eyes focusing on her. Mom. His voice was soft, hesitant, but it was him. It was really him. Daniel stood shakily, disbelief clouding his thoughts. Noah, you're okay. Noah nodded slowly, his eyes scanning their faces, taking in the strange, unfamiliar surroundings. I don't understand. What happened? We'll explain later, Daniel said, voice thick with emotion. For now, let's just be grateful you're here. But as they embraced, the world around them was not done. The battle was over. But the war, the struggle for survival, was far from finished. The air had a strange clarity now, as though the storm had passed, but left a weight behind. A sense that something immense had just shifted. For a moment, it felt as though they were standing in a space outside of time, a limbo between realms, a place where the boundaries of reality had been bent and broken. The relief was tangible, yet it was fleeting. Noah, still shaking off the disorientation, stood between Daniel and Emily. His eyes flitted between them, searching their faces as if trying to find some clue, some explanation for what had happened. Mom, Dad, what is this place? Noah's voice was soft, uncertain, and Daniel could hear the underlying fear in his son's words. We don't know, Daniel admitted, his gaze sweeping across the landscape. The world around them was eerily still. The sky, once swirling with oppressive energy, was now calm, an endless blue canvas, unmarred by clouds. The ground was a smooth, polished surface, like glass that stretched on for miles. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of trees, only an overwhelming silence that seemed to hum in their ears. But that stillness was deceptive. "We need to keep moving," Emily said, her voice steady, though there was an edge of urgency to it. "This place, it's not right. We don't know how long we have before something else happens." Daniel nodded. He was still reeling from the confrontation with the creature, the force that had pursued them across dimensions. But Emily was right. They couldn't afford to stand still. The fight had left them drained, but they had made it this far. And Noah was with them again. But for how long? Daniel reached for his son's shoulder, guiding him forward as they started walking. Noah moved a little slower than usual, his steps hesitant, as if the weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on him. They all felt it, the enormity of what they had survived. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, though time was fluid in this strange place. The air was cool, but not cold. The ground beneath them felt strange, like walking on solidified air, and yet their feet left no marks, no signs of their passage. It was as if they were walking on a surface that was not quite solid, not quite real. Eventually they came to a clearing, a space that felt different, even more alien than the path they had walked. The soft blue of the sky above them shifted subtly, like ripples in water, and ahead they saw something that made their hearts skip a beat. A gate. It stood before them, towering and imposing, crafted from an impossibly smooth black stone. The gate was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its edges were sharp, its surface glimmering with a strange, shifting energy. "No," Emily whispered. "No, no, no." Daniel's heart began to race. This was it, the point of no return. They had come to the end of their journey, to the place where all of this had begun. The dark force that had hunted them, the creature that had been toying with them across realms. It had brought them here, to this gate. Is that the way out? gatekeepers didn't respond with words. Instead, their shapes twisted, becoming more monstrous, more undefined. The boundaries of their forms stretched and warped, like smoke that no longer followed any rules of nature. Daniel could feel the air growing colder, as if the world itself were fighting against them. "Emily, don't," Daniel warned, grabbing her arm. "We don't know what they'll do if we provoke them." But Emily pulled away, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and determination. "We're done hiding. They can't keep us here forever." Noah's hand gripped hers tighter, his voice quiet but strong. "I don't want to stay here, Mom. I don't want to be alone anymore." The weight of those words landed heavily in the air. Noah had been lost, taken, and now here he was, standing with them, alive, and yet the sense of finality pressed against them, as if everything had been building up to this very moment. The leader of the gatekeepers, the figure who had first spoken, shifted closer. It moved like a wisp of darkness, twisting unnaturally around them. Its voice was a whisper that seemed to crawl into their very minds. "You still do not understand." Daniel took a deep breath, standing tall. "I understand that you've been hunting us, toying with us. But we're not your playthings." The ground beneath them rumbled, a low growl of energy that vibrated through the air, unsettling their footing. The gatekeepers responded with a wave of power, an invisible force that pushed them backward. But Daniel stood firm, using every ounce of willpower to remain rooted in place. "Daniel," Emily began, but her voice was cut off by the gatekeeper's voice, which seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the vast space. "You do not belong in the world you came from." The words rang in Daniel's ears. "That's not true. We've fought for our survival every step of the way. We belong there, with the people we love." The figure did not answer immediately, but its presence seemed to grow. "You have defied what was meant to happen." The air crackled with darkness, the temperature plummeting as a chill gripped their bodies. "You are now a part of this place. There is no escape." Daniel felt the pull of finality sinking into his bones, the weight of their choices pressing on them with each word. This was the end game, the final test of their willpower, the moment where everything they had fought for would either be undone or solidified. Emily stepped forward again, undeterred. "We've already escaped," she said, her voice now resolute, like the final strike of a hammer. "This place isn't our world, and we don't belong here." The ground trembled beneath them, and for a moment, everything went still. The figures seemed to pause, their movements halted, their glowing eyes flickering as if considering her words. Then, with a sudden, violent shift, the world began to bend around them once more. Daniel's heart skipped. The gate, the path, the gatekeepers. Everything began to unravel. The world fractured as if the very fabric of reality were being torn. Pieces of the landscape distorted, faded, and vanished. And they were pulled ripped almost physically into something new. Their bodies swayed with the force of it, barely able to keep balance as they fell through fractured space. Then came the flash, a blinding light, and everything stopped when Daniel opened his eyes again. The world around him was not the fractured alien landscape of before. He was standing in a field they all recognized. The sky above was a calm, familiar blue, the clouds rolling lazily overhead. Birds chirped in the distance, and the smell of fresh grass filled the air. It was like nothing had happened. Emily's voice broke the silence. What? She looked around, her breath catching in her throat. Is this? Noah gasped. This is our home. They were standing at the edge of the field that led to their house, the one they had left behind when they first stepped into that storm. It was the same place, the same world, the same reality, and yet everything felt different. No, Daniel said, his voice uncertain. He looked around, his eyes scanning the landscape. The sun was shining, the world was calm, but something felt off. This can't be right. Emily stepped forward, a hand held out to Noah, who stood beside her, still looking bewildered. Is this real? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel tried to steady his breathing. It feels like it, but I don't know. Something isn't right. This isn't the end. Noah looked up at him, confusion in his eyes. But what else is there? Daniel swallowed hard. The truth was that they had no idea. The creatures, the gatekeepers, they had been real. Their power was real. But this place, this wasn't just the real world. It felt like something between worlds, a fragile point where choices could fracture reality. A low growl sounded in the distance, barely audible. Daniel froze. The world might look like their own, but the darkness wasn't finished. Something somewhere was still waiting for them to make the final choice. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to freeze the blood in Daniel's veins. A low, vibrating growl emanated from somewhere deep within the earth, a sound that seemed to shake the very air around them. It was a sound they had heard before, the primal hum of something not quite of this world. Did you hear that? Emily asked, her voice tight with fear as she looked around, eyes darting across the serene landscape, as though searching for the source of the disturbance. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He was trying to piece together the shattered fragments of their reality, the terrifying truths they had uncovered. This place, it looked like home. The peaceful meadow stretching before them was a picture of normalcy, but the deep rumble beneath, the earth had shattered that illusion. Noah, stay close, Daniel ordered, instinctively stepping between his son and the open field. His heart pounded, his senses on high alert. The gentle breeze that had once felt so soothing now chilled him to the bone, and the distant hum of life in the air felt distant and wrong. The once familiar world, they thought they had returned to felt like a mirror, warped and fractured. "We need to find out where it's coming from," Emily whispered, her hand tightening around Noah's as they both stepped closer to Daniel. The look on her face was one of determination, but it was tempered with a growing sense of dread. Something was off, wrong. Daniel glanced around. Their house was visible in the distance, an unassuming silhouette against the horizon, but it felt far away, too distant to offer any real safety. "We need to move," Daniel said again, his voice firm. He didn't want to admit it, but something inside him was screaming that this was not the safe haven it appeared to be. As they walked cautiously through the field, the sound grew louder, closer. It was as if the earth itself were rumbling, shaking off some ancient force that had been dormant for centuries. The gentle grass under their feet seemed to twist, each blade moving like the tendrils of an unseen force. It was subtle at first, but then the ground started to tremble in earnest. Emily gasped and stumbled, clutching Noah's hand as the ground beneath them shifted, pulling slightly in opposite directions, like the opening of some terrible abyss. Daniel's heart thudded painfully in his chest, his mind reeling. "We're not alone," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. His instincts screamed that whatever they had left behind was still with them, still hunting them, still twisting the world around them. Suddenly the earth split. A dark fissure cracked open at their feet, snaking across the ground like the jagged maw of some ancient beast. The rumble grew louder, almost deafening, as dark tendrils of smoke and shadow poured from the rift. It was like something was clawing its way out of the earth, and Daniel could feel the air becoming thick with darkness. "We have to go," Emily said urgently, her voice filled with terror. She tugged at Noah, her face pale. "Now." But as she turned to move, the earth beneath them surged, and the fissure widened with a sickening sound, snapping the ground into jagged shards. The noise was deafening, like the breaking of the world. "No, no," Daniel shouted, grabbing Emily's arm as the rift began to grow, its edges glowing with an unnatural, menacing light. The world was splitting apart before them, the peaceful landscape vanishing into an endless void of darkness. It wasn't just the earth cracking, it was reality itself unraveling. "Noah, stay close," Daniel shouted, pulling his son to him. The boy was trembling, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something else. Something in Noah's eyes that made Daniel pause. Noah was staring at the growing rift. His eyes were wide, but there was no terror there. Instead, there was something else, something familiar in the depths of his gaze, something dangerous. "Noah." Daniel's voice was sharp, but the boy didn't respond. His feet were rooted to the ground, and his eyes were locked on the dark rift, his expression unreadable. "Emily." "Something's wrong with him," Daniel muttered, stepping forward and reaching for his son. "Noah." Emily's voice was gentle now, but there was a tremor of fear in it. "Honey, we have to go." But Noah didn't budge. His feet were like stone, and his face had shifted, his features becoming sharper, more alien. His small frame seemed to grow heavier, his movements slower, like he was no longer fully a part of this world. The crackling energy in the air made his hair stand on end, and Daniel could feel a terrible tension building around them. And then, suddenly, Noah whispered in a voice that wasn't his own, "This is where you were always meant to be." Daniel froze. His heart stopped. It was him, but it wasn't him. The voice that came from Noah was deeper, colder, filled with a darkness that shouldn't have been possible. The boy's eyes glowed now, reflecting the unnatural light of the rift, and his small hands clenched into fists. The tendrils of shadow around them seemed to answer his unspoken command, shifting in the air like living things. "Noah, no," Emily gasped, taking a step forward, but Daniel gripped her arm tightly. "This isn't him, Em. This is something else," Daniel said, his voice low and tight. The realization hit him like a hammer. The creature, the force that had been chasing them, was not just trying to invade their world. It had already moved in, and it was using Noah as its vessel. "Noah, listen to me," Daniel called out, his voice breaking. "This isn't you. Fight it. You're stronger than this." But Noah's eyes, those glowing eyes, remained fixed on the rift as if beckoning it, as if it had been calling to him all along. "You have no choice." The words rumbled out of his throat, sounding like thunder, but there was a chilling calm in Noah's expression. The ground beneath their feet seemed to split even further, and the shadows that had once been just a presence around them now materialized, swirling around Noah, stretching toward the rift like a dark, insatiable tide. Daniel's mind raced. "Emily, we need to pull him back. Now," Daniel yelled, desperation clawing at his chest. But just as Emily moved to reach for Noah, the shadows lashed out, wrapping around her, pulling her back with a force that left her gasping for air. "Em," Daniel shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. The shadows had already enveloped her, and she was being pulled away into the darkness beyond. "No!" Daniel screamed, his voice raw with panic. He reached out, but the distance between them was growing, like they were slipping into different realms. The rift widened even further, the blackness swallowing everything. The sound of Emily's voice was distant, growing quieter as she was pulled further from him. He was losing her. And as Daniel reached for his wife, his son, his once innocent son, spoke again in that terrible otherworldly voice. "You will join us too." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, the beat erratic, as if trying to escape from the storm that was churning inside him. He reached for Emily, but the darkness had swallowed her, dragging her into the depths of the rift with a speed that left him gasping. The ground beneath him trembled again, the rift pulsating like a heartbeat, its terrible power pulling at him with a force that felt too vast to comprehend. "No!" Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse, but there was no answer from the shadows. The space around him seemed to collapse inward, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. His mind raced, every thought twisted into a frantic spiral. Emily was gone, and Noah wasn't Noah anymore. The boy, the vessel, stood at the center of the storm, his eyes glowing with that unnatural light, a reflection of something ancient and primal. The words that had come from his lips weren't his own. They never had been. "You will join us too." The voice boomed again, not from Noah's lips, but from the very air around them. It wasn't just an echo, it was a promise. Daniel's legs felt like they were made of stone as he stumbled forward, his hand outstretched toward the rift. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he was doing, only the primal need to reach her, to pull her back from whatever darkness had claimed her. He couldn't lose her, not like this. "Noah, I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, though the words felt meaningless in the face of this new terror. He could see his son's face, still the same face, but altered, twisted by the dark force that had consumed him. And yet, through the layers of terror, there was still something that felt like a flicker of humanity inside Noah. A small, faint light that refused to be swallowed whole. Hope. "Noah," Daniel cried, reaching out. His fingers brushed against the boy's shoulder, the connection brief, but the touch was enough to cause a sudden change. The boy's body stiffened, the glowing eyes narrowing, as though fighting something within. For a moment it seemed as if Noah might fight back, but then the shadows tightened, and the voice, the entity, grew louder, more forceful. "Do you think you can stop what is inevitable?" The voice thundered, shaking the air. The ground cracked under their feet, splitting open even further as a tide of darkness swarmed toward them. Daniel felt the world shifting again, but this time it wasn't just the rift. It was the very fabric of existence itself. The shadows pulsed with an energy that felt alive, and the rift behind Noah began to widen, expanding like an infinite maw. A horrifying realization slammed into Daniel. This wasn't just about Noah anymore. The entity wasn't just trying to consume his son. It was trying to consume them all. It had already begun. Daniel's heart raced as his thoughts spun. He had to make a choice, a final choice. If he didn't do something now, Emily would be lost to him forever. And Noah would remain this twisted, empty vessel. There had to be a way to reach him, to break the grip of the entity. With renewed desperation, Daniel grabbed Noah's arm, pulling him away from the growing darkness. "Noah, listen to me. You're stronger than this. Fight it." The boy's body twitched, and for a second, his glowing eyes flickered like a flame struggling against the wind. Daniel could see the struggle within his son. His voice trembled as he spoke again. "Noah, you are my son. You can fight this. Noah's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, there was a low growl, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to resonate through the earth itself. The rift pulled at them, and the shadows pressed in tighter, threatening to swallow them whole. In that moment, Daniel realized something. They couldn't just fight the darkness. They had to understand it. They had to acknowledge the truth that the entity was not simply some force from another realm. It was a manifestation of everything they had feared. It was the embodiment of their choices, the culmination of their desires, their deepest fears. And there, in the heart of that chaos, Daniel felt it, the deep, unshakable truth. The storm was never just the weather. He had been wrong. The storm, the creatures, the shadows, it wasn't just something external. It was a manifestation of their inner turmoil, their inner darkness. The storm had been following them from the very beginning, but it wasn't merely chasing them. It was pushing them, testing them, and if they were ever going to escape it, they had to confront that darkness. They had to face what was waiting in the heart of the storm. But how? Do you think you can stop me? The voice came, again, more mocking now, its laughter echoing through the air. The darkness continued to spread, the rift widening with every passing second. Daniel's grip tightened on Noah's arm. "You don't control us," he said, his voice raw. "You don't control him." For the first time, Noah's face flickered, his eyes blinking as though he was seeing Daniel again. His voice, weak, trembling, finally broke through the oppressive force. "Dad." Daniel's breath caught. "Noah." And then, in that moment, everything shifted. The rift quivered, and the shadows, like living creatures, stopped, as though waiting. Daniel's body trembled, but he could feel something else now, an invisible force pulling them in two directions. His instincts screamed for him to protect his family, to save Emily, to bring his son back. But there was something in the rift now, a presence so powerful, so ancient, that the very air around them seemed to warp in its presence. Daniel took a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. The darkness would not let go without a fight. The air had become heavy, thick with the oppressive presence of the entity that stood before them. The rift was no longer just a tear in the world. It had become a living, breathing thing, its dark tendrils writhing and reaching into the very fabric of reality itself. Daniel stood frozen, his hand still clutching Noah's arm, but his son's body was no longer his own. The boy's eyes glowed brighter now, and the shadows around them seemed to be answering his silent command. "Noah," Daniel whispered again, his voice breaking. "You have to fight it. You have to fight for your mother, for us." But Noah didn't respond. The voice that came from his lips wasn't the boy's anymore, but that same deep, guttural sound that echoed from the rift itself. "You cannot stop what has already begun." The words were cold, final. The rift's edges seemed to pulse with dark energy as it slowly enveloped Noah. wrapping him in its grip. The shadows were becoming part of him, his small body a vessel for something ancient, something infinite. Daniel's heart sank, his breath caught in his chest. He could still feel the faint flicker of his son's spirit deep inside the vessel, but it was becoming harder to distinguish. The boy he had loved, the son who had once smiled and laughed, was slipping away. He had to act, and he had to act fast. Taking a deep breath, Daniel's mind flashed back to the moment before the rift had fully opened, the way the air had thickened, the way the storm had felt like something more than just a weather pattern. It was an embodiment of everything they had run from. The guilt, the fears, the unspoken truths they had buried deep inside themselves. Me if you can. The voice was mocking now, an all-knowing whisper in Daniel's ear. You are nothing but ants beneath my feet. Daniel's pulse quickened. It had to be a trick. The voice, the entity, the shadows. They were trying to break him, to make him doubt. But Daniel's love for his son, his wife, was stronger than anything the entity could throw at him. He knew it. He turned to Emily's side where she had disappeared into the rift, her voice fading with every passing second. His heart wrenched in his chest as he thought of her, trapped in the darkness, somewhere in the void between worlds. I'm coming, Em, he whispered under his breath, his grip tightening on Noah's arm. The storm raged overhead, lightning crackling through the sky, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves in the distance. But amidst the chaos, Daniel found a quiet space within himself, a calmness that allowed him to think clearly. He knew now that he couldn't face this alone. He had to reach Noah somehow, and in doing so, they would have to face the entity as a family. They had to confront what had brought them here. He couldn't save Noah by force alone. He had to remind him who he was. Noah, listen to me. Daniel's voice was steady now, stronger than it had ever been. I know you're still in there. I know you can hear me. Your mother, she's still out there. She needs you. I need you. There was a faint flicker in Noah's eyes, a brief glimmer of recognition, but it was fleeting, almost imperceptible. The shadows around them quivered in response. They seemed to shudder with rage, as if fighting against Daniel's words. But his conviction was stronger. Noah, Daniel repeated, his voice trembling with urgency. This is our fight. You're not alone. You've never been alone. For a moment, the rift seemed to pause, as if it were listening. The shadows stopped moving, and for a brief, fleeting instant, it felt like time had frozen. And then, just as quickly, the shadows tightened around them again, as if the entity had sensed its grip slipping. The ground beneath them cracked again, the rift growing wider with each passing second. Noah, fight back, Daniel shouted, his voice raw. Don't let it take you. You're stronger than this. You're my son. The voice that emerged from Noah's mouth was no longer mocking. There was confusion in it now. Confusion and something else. Pain. Dad. The word was weak, but it was enough. It was enough to ignite something in Daniel's heart. Noah, I'm here. I'm right here. You're not alone, remember? And in that moment, something shifted. A spark of light flickered in Noah's eyes. Faint, but undeniable. It was his son, his Noah, struggling against the darkness that had consumed him. The shadows around them pulsed as if fighting to keep him trapped. But Daniel could feel it. The pull, the struggle. The way Noah was slowly starting to push back. You think this will stop me? The entity's voice echoed again, deep and menacing. I have already claimed this world. You cannot defeat me. But Daniel didn't listen. Instead, he dropped to his knees, grabbing Noah's shoulders and shaking him gently, his voice fierce with love. Noah, fight this. Fight it for your mother, for us. The light in Noah's eyes flickered again. He gasped as if waking from a long, terrible sleep, his body jerking as if something was trying to break free. Daniel held on, his heart racing as he pulled his son closer, the darkness pressing in around them, threatening to swallow them whole. But the light in Noah's eyes was growing stronger, and the shadows, flickering uncertain, began to retreat. Noah, Daniel whispered, his voice soft, bleeding. You're not alone. We'll fight this together. I love you, son. Don't let go. And in that moment, as the world seemed to bend and break around them, Daniel felt a presence, a warmth, a sudden shift. The rift began to tremble, the shadows swirling wildly. But it wasn't a victorious darkness. It was a fading one. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel felt hope stir in the heart of the storm. The storm raged on, but there was a strange quiet within the chaos. The oppressive force of the rift trembled, the shadows receding, as if they were being pulled back from a precipice. The once powerful glow in Noah's eyes flickered, but it wasn't the same cold, malevolent light as before. It was dimmer, weaker, like the last embers of a dying fire. And in its place, something else was taking root, a force of resistance. Daniel held on to his son, his grip firm but gentle, as if he were afraid that if he loosened his hold for even a moment, Noah might slip away again. The shadows swirled around them, but now they were more like fleeting wraiths, their power less certain, less absolute. It was as if the very foundation of the rift, the entity that had created it, was beginning to falter. The darkness that had consumed everything was suddenly hesitant, and the air felt different, less suffocating, more fragile. Noah, do you hear me? Daniel's voice was low, almost a whisper, but he spoke with an authority that he hadn't known he had. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw the faintest flicker of recognition in his son's eyes. You're not alone. You're not alone, son. You've never been alone. For a brief moment, Noah blinked, his face contorting with confusion, as though he were trying to separate the fog of shadows from the reality before him. The boy's chest heaved with labored breaths, and Daniel could see the internal struggle, the fight to regain control of his body, to reclaim himself. And then, like a spark in the dark, Noah's voice broke through, weak but unmistakably his own. Dad. Daniel's heart leaped in his chest. There it was. It was his son. The true Noah was fighting, clawing his way back through the veil of darkness. Noah, I'm here. I'm right here, buddy. Fight. Daniel's voice cracked, desperation rising within him. Fight it, son. We've got this together. You and me. But the darkness, the force that had claimed so much of the world, wasn't ready to let go. The shadows swarmed around them, thick and oppressive, pressing in as if to crush the fragile light that Noah was struggling to hold on to. The rift trembled once more, growing wider, deeper, its pull growing stronger as the storm raged around them. Daniel could feel it. He could feel the strength of the entity, its hunger, its need to consume. It was angry now, furious that its grip was loosening, that the family was fighting back. You cannot win, Daniel. The entity's voice was like thunder, shaking the ground beneath them. The air crackled with energy, and the very world around them seemed to bend in response. The rift widened further, darkness spilling into the world like a flood. Noah, Daniel shouted, shaking him again, trying to reach the flicker of humanity within. Don't let it take you. You're stronger than this. We're stronger than this. Noah's body jerked as the shadows tried to pull him back. The force of the rift ripping at his consciousness, trying to drown him in its chaos. But there was a subtle change, a shift in the atmosphere. The rift, once consuming, was beginning to flicker like a dying fire. Noah, Daniel whispered again, his breath coming faster. You have to fight. You're my son, and I won't let you go. The entity roared in response, the shadows around them tightening like a noose. But Noah's eyes, those eyes that had once been filled with glowing light, began to clear. There was no longer the same pull toward the rift. The boy's gaze fixed on his father, and in that moment, Daniel knew Noah was coming back. Noah, listen to me. You can beat this. This thing doesn't control you. It doesn't control us. Daniel's words were sharp, filled with the intensity of his conviction. And then, as if in answer, a brilliant light exploded from within Noah. A surge of pure, radiant energy that shattered the darkness around them. The rift, its edges cracked and splintered as the force that had held it together faltered. The darkness howled, but it was no longer all-encompassing. It was unraveling. The shadows scattered like wisps of smoke in the wind, and for the first time, Daniel felt the oppressive weight lift from his shoulders, the pressure of the rift releasing its grip. The storm's fury was still there, but its power was fading. The world was no longer on the edge of total collapse. Noah gasped, his chest heaving as he regained his senses. His eyes, now his own, blinked, as if he were seeing for the first time in what felt like forever. The storm above them still raged, but it was no longer the destructive force it once had been. It was now a storm without a master, a storm losing its purpose. Dad. Noah's voice was weak, but full of relief. I'm so sorry. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he pulled his son into a tight embrace. No, Noah, don't apologize. We're okay. We're okay. The rift, now breaking apart, began to dissipate into the wind, leaving behind only the remnants of its presence. The storm's violence had subsided, its hunger sated for the moment. But Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The entity, the force behind the rift, was still out there, somewhere. It had been weakened, but it had not been defeated. It had just retreated. But for now, Daniel held his son, his arms wrapped around him, and he let the calm wash over him. They had won this battle. Together, above them, the storm was beginning to break. The sky, still clouded, held the promise of a new dawn, one that was not yet fully here, but one that was coming. The fight was far from over, but they had taken the first step. The storm had receded, but the battle was far from over. Daniel stood with his son, Noah, the boy still trembling in his arms, the faintest remnants of the darkness swirling in the air around them. The rift had closed, but the ground beneath their feet was still cracked, the earth scarred by the entity's lingering presence. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth, a sharp, metallic tang that made Daniel's stomach churn. Noah, Daniel whispered, pulling back slightly to look at his son, his hands still resting on his shoulders. We need to be ready. It's not over yet. The entity, it's still out there. Noah nodded weakly, his face pale but determined. His breathing was steadying, but the fear in his eyes hadn't completely gone. The pull of the rift, the call of the darkness, it still lingered in the corners of his mind. I know, Noah said quietly, but I can feel it, Dad. It's not gone. It's just waiting. Daniel's heart ached at the fear in his son's voice, but he understood. They had only won a small victory, but that victory meant everything. The rift had weakened, the storm had subsided, but the entity's power had not been extinguished. It had only been forced to retreat for now, and it was waiting for the right moment to strike again. Then we'll be ready, Daniel said firmly, his voice gaining strength. Together, the ground trembled again, as if the world itself was on the brink of collapse. The storm had not fully passed. Its heart was still there, beating in the distance, waiting for its chance to surge again. Daniel could feel it in his bones, the way the air had shifted after the rift closed. The entity was not gone, and it was not finished with them. But this time, it would not be so easy to reclaim them. We need to find your mother, Daniel said, his voice hardening with resolve. Emily's out there somewhere, and we're going to get her back. The entity won't stop until it has all of us. But if we can find her, if we can bring her back too, maybe, just maybe, we can finish this Noah looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Dad, I'm scared. What if we can't stop it? What if it's too strong for us? Daniel knelt down, taking Noah's hands in his. We've faced it together, and we're going to keep facing it. We have something the entity doesn't: love. It's not just a word, Noah. It's power. And we can fight this darkness with that power. We can bring your mom back. We can save this world. Noah didn't say anything, but the way he clung to his father's hands spoke volumes. The boy was scared, yes, but he wasn't backing down. He was with Daniel every step of the way, and that meant everything. In the distance, the storm still howled, the dark clouds swirling ominously, but amidst the fury, there was a flicker of light, a small glimmer of hope. The storm would never be completely gone, but with each passing moment, it was weakening. The entity was being pushed back little by little, and Daniel could feel the truth in his heart. They could do this. They could win. Let's go, Daniel said softly, pulling Noah to his feet. We have to find your mom, Noah. We have to end this together. And with that, they turned toward the horizon, stepping through the remnants of the storm, knowing that the final battle was yet to come. But no matter what, they would face it together. The world was still broken, the shadows still lurking in the corners. But for now, Daniel and Noah had one another, and that was enough. Together they would face whatever came next.